11:14 BBC Radio Devon. Now, how has the pandemic affected the long-term prospects for our children? Potentially quite a lot, according to one of our guests today. Leonora Langley has divided her professional life between education and journalism, beginning as a teacher in the 1970s. Her new book, Let the Souls of Our Children Sing, suggests that the COVID generation of young people had suffered stress, depression and anxiety as a result of the pandemic. I'm very glad to say that Leonora is with us. Leonora, what promoted you to look into this?
Well, when I was a teacher in my 20s, which was quite a long time ago, I just felt a real need to listen, to connect, to understand our children in a much more loving and caring way. I just felt that they were not being really listened to as effectively as they might be, which really was the seed of this book.
And presumably that's where that title comes from, Let the Souls of Our Children Sing. You feel that those voices are being muffled.
I do. I think it makes sense for us to encourage and help our children to discover their emotional stuff and nurture their souls so that they can experience the careless and carefree rapture of childhood. And this will give them a greater sense of peace and contentment that they will be able to share with others. And if we encourage and allow the souls of our children to sing, I think that joy can last a lifetime.
Have you seen personally the damage that this has done? Because no child, no human should be isolated, especially for 2 years.
Very interesting question. Although the so-called COVID generation of children have suffered undue stress, depression and anxiety during the past 2 years, I think it feels like they've been confined as if in a chrysalis. I don't believe the pandemic has created a mental health crisis out of nowhere. I think that what COVID has done is to accentuate and amplify a catastrophe that has been underplayed for a very long time. So for decades, we've turned a blind eye to this escalating problem of children's mental health, at home and at school. COVID, I think, provided us with a wake-up call. Apparently, we're in a situation in the UK where 1 in 6 children suffers from an identifiable mental health issue, and 12.3% have a special need. During my 30 years as a teacher and 15 as a counsellor, I think we've now reached a point where nearly all children have a special need to a greater or lesser degree.
What's changed, do you think? What's brought this about?
Well, obviously, everything's been exacerbated during the last 2 years. So it was always there, the problem was always there. But for instance, I've noticed that what might once have been described as minor depression in children, such as feelings of sadness and helplessness, has now turned into major depression due to the unprecedented stress and anxiety that they suffered during the pandemic, which sadly has led to more self-harming and suicidal ideation.
Yeah, and it has been a tough time. And of course, that's not even touching on the education that's been lost over those 2 years as well.
I've got to say there, let's not point toward... Well, yes, let's point towards the internet access. Imagery there, which can affect children, the standards that they should be living up to. Maybe those standards are set by others. It's porn, solitude, constant gaming. Children these days have so many different factors that's going to affect them. Would you agree, Leonora, that on top of the isolation of COVID, there are so many more damaging strategies out there?
Definitely. I think children's current addiction to computers and social media simply places too much emphasis on external validation. We need to encourage our children to have a richer interior life, to get in touch with their internet, if you like. In other words, less internet and more internet. I think young people need regular breaks from information overload and encouraged to take a detox from things like news, computers, data and mobiles. I don't think that the social media has caused the current exacerbation, but it certainly hasn't helped. As adults, we know that motivation and inspiration are essential when we're learning a new skill or pursuing a career. But what we're doing in mainstream secondary education is forcing young people to study and be proficient in 12 subjects, to give them a broad experience in case they need them later on. But by doing that, I think we're often going against their will, causing them to feel disempowered. And I think young people need to be taught according to their interests and passions, with freedom to study only the subjects they're naturally drawn to, and not forced to suffer those in which they have no interest.
There has to be a balance, though, presumably. You would surely say that they do need to study, the basics, maths and English.
Of course, they've got to be numerate and literate, otherwise life becomes very difficult. But it's all these extra subjects, they need greater choice, I think. In the junior school, they already get a very broad spectrum of subjects. I think the first year in secondary school needs to be a year of transition where they may be getting a taster of various subjects, because it's really traumatic, I think, emotionally, to make that transition from junior school to secondary school. And then by year 8, I think then they need a greater choice of subject matter so that they enjoy the experience instead of being forced to do something against their will.
Is that practical in smaller schools where they wouldn't necessarily have the capacity to offer more subjects than they do at the moment?
I think it is easier in small schools. 30 children in a classroom is an awful lot for a teacher to undertake. They've got 30 different psyches coming at them with 30 different emotional portraits. And that was the thing that I always found the most difficult at school, trying to reach the needs of every single person in the classroom. So I always welcomed a classroom assistant, especially one who was emotionally intelligent. It was an amazing experience for me to have that backup. The whole system, I think, needs reconfiguring, because really, since the 1870s, when mainstream education first came about, we've emphasised too much on cognition and logic because it can be counted and measured over the emotional well-being and the soul development of our children, which I think is beyond measure.
0808 100 1034. Keep your calls coming in, and there are calls coming in on this. You can text 81333, start your message with the word Devon. We're talking about, has the pandemic affected long-term prospects for our children? We've also mentioned the world of being online for anything up to 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day. Can I just tell you one story that my dentist told me, which I thought was rather alarming? He has in his waiting room a fish tank, a couple of guppy in there, a couple of gold things that flop around and go back towards you at the glass. Small 4-year-old child there was staring at the fish, and then on one particular occasion swiped right to left on the tank and was surprised that the image didn't change.
Do anything, no.
And he just said, "Now there's someone who spent a little too much time on the interweb."
And Leonora Langley is a former teacher, counsellor and an international journalist. And she's also the author of a new book, which is talking about the way, whether we're educating our children in the right way or treating them in the right way, essentially. It's called Let the Souls of Our Children Sing. And Leonora, we've talked about what's potentially causing the issues that you're seeing. How are they manifesting themselves, though? What is the problem for our children today that they're experiencing?
I think the biggest problem is that education has become an exam factory. There's going to be a proportion of children who turn up at school with a wounded spirit or broken heart who simply can't access an academic life because they haven't had some nurturing emotional experience in their early years. I think that early emotional input from the parents is absolutely vital to a young child. So the first half of my book is devoted to parents as educators. Raising children is the hardest job in the world. None of us gets it right. I certainly didn't. And I say in the preface of my book, this is the book that I would like to have accompanied the birth of my son.
Well, we always say, don't we? There's no handbook when your baby arrives. No one gives you a manual. What would you have done differently then, Leonora?
Oh, I would have. Well, I hadn't trained as a counsellor when I had my son. I would have put far less pressure on him to become somebody like me. You know, I was a high-flying journalist. I had to really dig deep and say, no, I've got to switch now to being a nurturing, caring mother so that my child can look into my eyes and know that they feel safe. I think the first 18 months, children are almost in a womb-like state, and they desperately need that undivided attention from the mother so that they do feel safe and cared for. I think all too soon now, women want to get back to work. They've become so used now to being out in the workplace, and quite rightly so. They don't want to be tied to the kitchen sink. But there has to be a better balance. I think when you're giving birth to another human being, you have to give those first few years, devote those first few years to your child.
Many need to get back to work.
Tough for some women.
Some people just can't afford not to.
I absolutely understand the financial consideration, but when you think about it very deeply, a child doesn't need materialism. They just want the parents to be present and caring. So maybe we have to do without some of the niceties of life in those early years of raising our children. We can't have it all. We simply can't. There has to be a balance. A lot of people think my book's sort of controversial. I don't think it's certainly not for the faint-hearted, but it's certainly not for those who have no desire to change. In some ways, my book encourages readers to consider their shadow side, their dark aspects. But when people are brave enough to face their negative aspects and emotion, possibly through therapy, I think the rewards can be life-changing. And that's, our children need to have us present. And I think sometimes now that parents are preoccupied with other things.
Leonora, look, we have to thank you for joining us today. But just briefly, how do you relax? Where do you go? I've just noticed your love of opera and
Yes.
Glyndebourne. Beautiful place.
Well, I was in a position when I taught in Brighton. I was director of music at a very tough school that was on constant special measures. And I had to dig deep to help these children. And I put on a performance of Grease, which encouraged them to feel safe on a stage where they hadn't been before. And 11 of my students got into Glyndebourne Opera House, where they were doing a children's opera. And the empowerment that those children got from that experience was extraordinary. And 300 children from the school were in the auditorium watching these 11 students. I think music has been the most amazingly powerful influence on my life. It's been like a rich tapestry that's woven into my life. And without it, I wouldn't have been nearly the person that I am. I still teach the piano, and I just love the connection that I have with my students. It gives them time off from all the exam-oriented stuff that they're doing at school, gives them time to relax. It empowers them in a different way from normal school life. And I think there needs to be a greater emphasis on the arts in schools. I think it's all too science-based, because the arts allow children to imagine, to create, and to dream. And without those facilities, our children have a far less rounded experience at school.
Leonora, a couple of people supporting you, you'll be pleased to know. Plymouth Jana says, very sensible lady, in capital letters with 2 exclamation marks. I hope the government is listening. The current national curriculum is government constructed with the sole aim of producing smart, money-making individuals for government gain, of course. Encouraging individuals to develop their own strengths and skills would make for a much happier, healthy, less stressed society. It's interesting that even people who homeschool will soon be forced to follow the national curriculum. And Chris in Perth says, I'm not sure whether this is Perth, Scotland or Perth, Australia, but it says, I'm listening to the words of wisdom from your guest, Leonora. So true. Can you repeat the name and publisher of her book? Well, Chris, we can do that. Lena, we'll have to let you go in just a second. But the book, I can tell you, is called Let the Souls of Our Children Sing, and it's published by
Austin Macaulay, and it's only $8.99 a copy for the paperback, and I think it's about $3.50 for the ebook, and available on Amazon, which is where most of my sales have been.
There you are, you see. Commercialism swashing gently over the BBC.
Oh, definitely. Sorry, I thought that's what you wanted from me.
No,
Absolutely.
Leonora, never
That's
let it
good
be
to know.
said that we've ever strangled commercialism here.
There has to be a balance.
There has to be
Absolutely.
a balance.
As with
So
so many...
lovely to connect with you guys. So
Likewise,
lovely.
and you, thank you.